My name is Nipun. I am visiting Auroville just for 2 days, and I'm very happy to be here. I think my intention is to offer a few seed thoughts, but underneath the thoughts, I think to offer a few seed uh, sort of values, maybe spectrums of values that we can explore in the startup designs that we create. Um, so I'll start a little broader, and I'll basically share from my experience. So it's less theory and more story. So those of you who are allergic to love, I apologize up front. If you feel nauseated, you might vomit. I hope not. I hope not. But yeah, I'll share a little bit as soon as I get a thumbs up from everybody else. Um, so I'll start with this beautiful or not so beautiful, depending on your perspective, experiment. This is the world's most famous podcaster, Joe Rogan. And this, of course, is Steve Jobs. The interesting thing is that Joe Rogan interviewed Steve Jobs a few months ago. And you say, well, Steve Jobs passed away over a decade ago. How can he interview him? They put all his content into an AI, and he was asking him questions about today's world. This guy was the first president of Google, Eric Schmidt. He heard that interview, and he says, I was in tears because I had known Steve Jobs for 35 years, and this is exactly the kind of responses Steve would give. So what to make of this kind of a scenario where you look and you say, what does this mean? But before we can even ask what it means, if you look at the adoption rates of technologies and the innovations we are creating, what took TV 75 years to hit 100 million users, it takes Netflix 10 years, takes Facebook 4.5 years, and it takes TikTok 9 months, and it takes ChatGPT 2 months. And it takes Facebook Threads 5 days. So what was once 75 years, and we all negotiated a relationship to TV. At least, I don't know about you, I grew up and we had like a TV quota on certain days of the week, right? But we all collectively were able to negotiate that. Now we have no idea what to even think of. We didn't know what to make of social media, and now it's even faster. So in this kind of a context, I think the question that comes up, mostly I have questions for you. I don't really have answers. I have some stories from my experience, but really what I want to do in this presentation is to raise questions. A question is, who do we have to be, we ourselves, to design for a future we cannot see? So all those executives, maybe 20 years ago, they would have a 5-year plan. Today, I'm from the Silicon Valley. Any CEO that gives you a 5-year plan, they have no idea what they're doing. I mean, that is not a company you would ever invest in because everything changes so fast. So if you don't have a 5-year plan, if you don't have a 2-year plan, I mean, you can have a plan, right? But how do you be agile? But more importantly, for you to be agile externally, who do you have to be internally? That's a question that interests me and has interested me for a while. And I think what that forces us into is this question. This is a very troubling question for the ego because what is our relationship to the known? That's easy. Ego is very comfortable in the known. I know. I have ideas. I have processed all this. What is our relationship to the unknown? Unknown is still unknown, so it's a little scarier, but not that much scarier because, I may not know how to swim, but I didn't know how to ride a bicycle, and I learned how to ride a bicycle. So I know how to master the unknown. I have confidence. But now, where we're forced into is what is our relationship to the unknowable? And usually this would be like spiritual people talking about this question. But now this is Sundar Pichai, CEO of Google. Very nice guy. He comes out on national TV before his product launches, and he says, oh, by the way, we don't know what this is going to do. No CEO has ever done that in the history of products. Why would you go on national TV and say, I'm going to come out, we're going to issue this thing called Google Bard, and yeah. And so the interviewer looks and says, what do you mean you don't know? He says, well, it hallucinates. And then he says, well, what do you mean? Can you give me an example? He says, it learns things we never told it to learn. He says, like what? And he says, well, for instance, we never told it to learn Bengali, and it just realized it needed to learn Bengali, and so it learned it. And the interview stops there, which is a nice sort of PR response, because Bengali seems like, oh, that's kind of amazing. Wow, it learned Bengali. But then it can also learn how to create 1,000 versions of coronaviruses. It can also learn how to shut down electrical grids. It can also do all kinds of other things, right? So, what is our relationship to the unknowable? Is it scary? Is it engaging? What do we do? It's not just a spiritual question now, it's an engineering question, it's a startup question, it's an innovation question now, which is exciting for those who have the inner lens as well. Just to give you a little bit of my journey, I was in the Silicon Valley context, in the context of immense greed. I grew up right before the dot-com era hit. I studied computer science and philosophy, and everyone around me was innovation, all this enthusiasm, creativity, but there was also a lot of greed. The campus where I worked, my one and only job out of college, in my third year of college, I got a job optimizing C++ compilers. And it's now that very campus is the headquarters of Facebook. That company was bought by Oracle, but I don't know if I should be even mentioning that, but that's there. So this was my initial part of my journey. But then in my early 20s, even I said, this is not what speaks to me. But there's a lot of good here. There's a lot of creativity, enthusiasm, energy. Can we use it for other purposes beyond greed? So as Devin said, we started Service Space, and that was like the second thrust of my journey. Generosity. And in the Silicon Valley here, as you can see, they're sort of making fun of me. They're like, oh, this guy, they could be charging, doing all this stuff. And he's got a plan to change this. I had zero plans. I didn't even know how to change myself. How in the world am I going to change other people, But everyone was like, they just thought that we would eventually grow up because we were building websites for nonprofits early on. And we weren't charging. We didn't want to brand anything. We had no agenda whatsoever. And people thought, that's cute. Tell us when you grow up, that sort of a thing. But what we discovered was a profound array of wealth that was non-financial, in that you could only access if you were practicing generosity. And then for me, the third part of my journey was even beyond generosity. The generosity actually got us a lot of social capital, but then beyond that, my wife and I went on a walking pilgrimage across India. We ate whatever food was offered and slept wherever place was offered. This is the kind of, it's a pretty radical thing. You've walked the Narmada a little bit, Siddharth. And when you look at that, when you live in that way every single day, right? It's a pretty profound, because usually we're so caught up in our ego that I have food because I am smart and I have secured my resources and I have, I everywhere, and that's why I have. Here, it's like, man, I am because you were kind, because you were generous. And that's a very profound, grace is this idea that things you receive it's unearned merit. So we all know about earned merit because that's what staff is, right? You go, you transact, you have a deal with your boss, and I do this and you give me this in return. But what about unearned merit? Usually we think the unearned merit is a small part of our lives. What I learned was, man, it's a pretty phenomenal part of our existence. And so this is just to give you context of where I'm coming from greed to, this is my 3G network, you know. I'm sure there's more other Gs beyond it to get to 5G, maybe next time I'm in Auroville. But what I saw is that there were three spheres of influence in terms of innovation, right? In terms of making creations in the world. One was in the field of awareness, right? That if I'm smoking and you show me an X-ray of what my lungs will look like, it changes my awareness that I shouldn't smoke. Doesn't always change behavior, but it's helpful. Awareness is good. Then you have impact. Impact says, I would really want to change and get you to stop smoking. And to stop smoking, you're addicted to nicotine. And so if you give a nicotine patch, it slowly weans your body off of nicotine addiction. And that's good. But then I go from nicotine to chocolate or 1,000 other things, or anger, or, you know, it's endless. And this is the third sphere, which is not information technology, but inner transformation. Transformation, fundamentally. So if I look at all the social change heroes, the people who have created projects in the world, startups, and some of them have scaled massively, there are those who lead with awareness, those who lead with impact, and then those who lead with transformation. Ultimately, you have to work at the intersection of all three, of course. But how do you lead with transformation? How are the designs different if you lead with transformation? They are significantly different. And what ends up happening is that if you usually people lead with impact, you have impact and you say, here's my project plan. And to accomplish that project plan, I need to have staff. So I hire people, I get people. And then you have an HR department that worries about inner transformation. Like, oh, it was well-being, purpose. Are you guys okay? You know, this is a typical model everywhere. But what we learned from the service-based experience, and I'll share a little bit more about that, is that we started with inner transformation. We said we're going to give for the purpose of changing ourselves. So what if nothing comes out of it? If we change, it's good. So we started with that, but when you do that, it's amazing that people start to gravitate towards it. And those people then are not just going to sit there, they're going to create projects. Projects will emerge. Like we're spending the day together, like stuff is going to emerge. And no one knows what it is, but it's going to be, it's beautiful. And those projects will have impact. We're doing this dialogue in Bangalore in 2 days, and that's actually at a restaurant called Just Be, and that started at, you know, at a startup service. There was a couple that said, we have space, we don't know what to do with it, and they said, now it's one of the top-rated restaurants across all of Bangalore. And they have a very deep food philosophy and just an incredible ripple. And so you'd be amazed how far things can go if we lead with inner transformation. But this is a flip of the paradigm, right? So I think at its core, this is one of my first big points, I would say. I think I only have 2 or 3 big points, so this is a big point. One big point here is that we are not merely what we do, but who we become by what we do. Your funders or, you know, all of those people, they don't really care for who you're becoming. They care for the impact and the output you create. And if that's all we're interested in, we're going to be outsourced by AI. But who can we become by what we do? So 2 stories of remarkable heroes, startup ventures that ended up changing the history, I would say, certainly a history of India, but of the world. You can even argue. One of them is this guy, Ishwar Patel. Ishwar Kaka changed the face of sanitation in this country. You know, women up until like maybe 30, 40 years ago, women would not be able to go to the bathroom all day. because they had to wait till it was dark. Then they could go out to the fields. Like, this is just wrong at every level. Ishwar Kaka said, I'm going to do something about it. You had all this casteism, you had all these issues. He went in and he would sit outside of toilets. Who wants to do toilet innovation, right? We all want to do tech innovation. I mean, I'm a tech innovator, right? Who wants to sit outside toilets and time people and design new toilets and then give people toilets and then they will say use it as storage areas, and then you're like, why do they still go in the fields when this is so much more hygienic? And he realizes that when people go in the fields, it's because they have community time. And so he says, my designs need to change. And so he put a window across all these toilets where they could talk with each other. He put a chalk outside where they could engage. All of a sudden, the adoption rate of the toilets goes up. But that's because he cared. When he passed away a few years ago, they'd shut down everyone from the highest ranking folks in India, in the business sector, political sector, every sector. They were all there, along with the janitors, along with the people who didn't even have a pakka house. They all came, they had to shut down entire streets of Ahmedabad. So at his funeral, all these people spoke. And then his wife was the last one to speak. His wife goes up and says, it's true. We started at whatever 120 plus organizations, built hundreds of thousands of toilets, all this stuff. And everyone was talking about how amazing he was in terms of his impact. He says, but I'm going to tell you an introduction to him that you may not know. And she shared one sentence. She says, I've been married to him over 50 years, I think over 60 even. I've been married to him for over 50 years, and this man never once got angry with me. He received the highest awards. He did everything. Like, you cannot have more fundamental impact than what Ishwar Kaka did. But his wife is like, that is nothing compared to who he became through the process. Never once got angry with me. That was all she said at the funeral. This is Dr. V. Oh, sorry. This is Dr. V. Dr. Venkataswamy, founder of Auroville Eye Hospitals. Also somebody I had the privilege of knowing. Who now their family is my family as well. It's my sister-in-law's grandfather. Dr. V changed eye care. He has given like 1 million people every year get eye care. Get not just eye care, they get eyesight. But Dr. V had rheumatoid arthritis. He's in his late 50s, and he says, I want to help. But it was like if you touch his bed, he shrieks in pain. So how can a crippled guy go and help other people? But he wasn't thinking like that. He was saying, if I lead with inner transformation, who knows what happens? So imagine, like, it took him a couple of years to just learn how to hold the instruments. He decided to do cataract surgeries. Half an hour surgery would change the lives of so many people, would give vision to people. Like, you're blind and now you can see. So he says, I want to do this. He learns how to hold the instruments. And then imagine if one of you is a venture capitalist and says, sir, would you, I have this good intention. Would you be willing to support my infrastructure costs? Nobody supported him. So he says, that's fine. I'll turn my living room into a 9-bed hospital. And then he said, for every paid customer, I'll treat 2 patients for free. I'll let them choose. Today, it's the longest running case study in the history of Harvard. Still, Abdul Kalam, when he was there, he was close friends with Dr. V. Abdul Kalam stood in the free line. He didn't know any better, but he got the same treatment. So you actually get to choose. You choose whether you want to be in the free line or the paid line. Both are same service. So he changed, but there are so many stories of not just what he did. There's a ton of stories of what he did. What he did is remarkable. But there's also a ton of stories of who he became by what he did. One time he came in to the hospitals and there was a new security guard. And then the security guard is like, "Hey, who are you crippled guy? Please wait over there." And he's explaining that no, my office is over there. He's a very simple person, you know. He didn't externally. You don't think he's a CEO of like a giant worldwide operation. He's like, "Hey, where do you think you're going?" "No, over there." And this guy was like his first day, so he was super pumped up, you know. And so he wouldn't let, and Dr. V's trying to explain to him, and he's like, doesn't even listen to Dr. V. He's like, "I don't want to hear it, you know, and he just kind of so he sat there for hours in the queue with the other people instead of like yelling at this guy and exerting his authority. And then his sister, Dr. Natcher, like sees and says, "Oh my God, like what, Dr. V, what are you doing here?" He says, "Well, the new security guard, you know, he was very enthusiastic about his job, and so he wouldn't let me in." And so she escorts him there. There are leaders like that. Like you don't need to be this, you know, that kind of a stereotype that we have in our mind of like it's either I win or you win, right? That sort of mentality that we have. That's actually, that's like crash and burn. That kind of thing actually never goes all too far. So here was Dr. V, and Dr. V would say, he would have these workshops with, you know, even in their own family. There's like 28 ophthalmologists, you know, it's an incredible family. But he would say that when you change who you become, you can start to see more. So he would show this photo to a bunch of people who are young, up and coming entrepreneurs. And he would say, "What do you see here?" Especially ophthalmologists, right? First, you see, "Oh, well, this looks like a person from the African continent." Okay. If you're an ophthalmologist, you would look at the eyes and you would kind of figure out the eye condition. But he would say, "How many of you noticed the earring?" And then he would say, "That's a Coke can. How did Coca-Cola get to that rural part of Africa? And why has eye care not reached there?" These are the kinds of questions he would ask. So when you're focusing on changing yourself through the process, the whole world looks very different. And I think what we start to do is start to play a more infinite game. So a finite game is played for the purpose of winning. Right? And we know where that is leading us. This is the founder of LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman. Again, a very nice guy. But he had this quote back in 2011 in the Wall Street Journal. He says, "You know, social networks do best when they tap into one of the 7 deadly sins. Facebook is ego, Zynga, which was a gaming company at the time, is sloth, and my own company, LinkedIn, is greed." So he's saying, "Oh, thank you all for using LinkedIn. But yeah, by the way, it operates by hacking your greed principle." And he may be right. But the question is, where are we going to find the 7 viral virtues and who is designing for that? And I think that's what excites me about things like Startup Service. So we're not just doing startups, right? We are saying, well, it's who I am. So thinking a lot deeper about 7 viral virtues. This is Sam Altman. And here's him. AI will most likely lead to the end of the world. But in the meantime, there will be great companies. You could argue he's the most powerful as far as corporate sector companies, CEOs go, especially with the recent OpenAI stuff that happened. You could argue he's one of the most powerful, and this is his quote. Okay, well, that's why you have a traffic jam. Right? You have all these stakeholders. You take any scenario anywhere in the world, there's just no easy through line. You're like, well, there's this, and then there's this, and then there's this. You try to solve one problem, and you have another one, and you have another one, and a third one. So you can feel good about the small problem you're solving, but then it's actually creating 5, 10, 15 more problems. And this is sort of the issue that we're trapped in, right? So in this context, if a finite game is played for the purpose of winning, the question is, how do we play a more infinite game? And an infinite game is played for the purpose of continuing the play, of continuing life. So how do we engage in that way? And it's all around us. This is one of my favorite photos in recent years. Thousands of birds, starlings, come together in a span of 2 seconds because there was a parasite. They needed to respond, and they formed this shape in 2 seconds. Like, can thousands of human beings do that in 2 seconds? The guy who took the photo didn't even realize he took the photo because in another 2 seconds, they dispersed. So this kind of a thing, I think this finite and infinite game, what it brings into tension, this is another key question, is how do we balance narrow margin goals with broad margin goals? Narrow margin goal is the immediate, right? So at a personal level, you can say narrow margin goal is I get angry. Sometimes that's actually effective, right? So you're like, oh, that worked. Because if I was kind and nice, it wouldn't work, right? So you can justify that, but then broad margin goal, it'll eat you up longer term. So how are we going to balance the narrow and the broad? Interpersonally, you say, well, I should stand for something. I have conviction, but then that starts to polarize you. Longer term, you're much better off with tolerance. So it's not one or the other. It's like you got to have conviction and you better have humility too. What's the right balance? You can go even farther systemically. My company's going to make profit in the next quarter or the year, right? Or politically, next term or the next re-election. But what's the broad margin goal? Because let's say we're both running companies and, the example I use is of Sabbath in the Jewish faith. They had this practice of Sabbath, seventh day. Nobody engages in any technology. And if my company is competing with your company and you say, wow, it's a whole day of no activity, forget it. I don't need Sabbath. My company's going to win because I'm working 7 days a week. You're only doing 6 days a week. So in the narrow margin goal, I win. In the broad margin goal, we all lose. So Sabbath, if you didn't actually stick to that seventh day, it was a shared agreement. If you don't do that, it was punishable to death. And you're like, oh my God, thou shalt meditate or you will die. It doesn't sound right when you look at it in isolation, but if you realize that if none of us have that shared agreement, we actually derail everybody. And this is the story of the current world. It's like we don't know how to balance narrow margin goals and broad margin goals. We have no idea how to address the climate issue. We have no idea how to address inequality in the world. We have no idea how to deal with all the rising suicides that are happening. We have no idea how to deal with declining trust. We just have no idea how to solve major problems. So we're heating up against a lot of this. And a big part of it is that these narrow and broad margin goals are colliding with each other. I mean, this is broad margin goal. This is narrow margin. I don't know if you guys like all that stuff, but there was this big story yesterday. Krispy Kreme, which is an American fast food chain, very, very bad for you, came to France. France is a country that usually protects its culture. They for the longest time did not want American fast food, but as of yesterday, 500 people lined up for the opening Krispy Kreme, right? Like, so narrow margin, broad margin, we have to deal with that. Okay, a few insights from our experience. So ServiceSpace has been doing all this work for the last 25 years. Instead of having staff, it's a bit radical in its approach. So I'm not suggesting everyone needs to do that. But through that practice of 25 years, we have learned a lot about some of its principles. And so perhaps some of that may be helpful too. In terms of the work that we do, it sees, I think, about 500,000 people come to our websites every day. and it just keeps multiplying, and all of it operates in a very radical way. So it gives us an interesting idea. But our initial thought was, instead of having 5 staff work 40 hours a week, we will have 40 volunteers who are moved by love, contribute 5 hours a week, and we'll coordinate that. And then we realized, wow, we actually have an infinite supply of people who are moved by love. And we said, we can have institutional capacity. So we started doing a lot of different projects. They went to offline. In the pandemic, we created this peer learning sort of technology. And most recently, we've been running, I think we run over 100 bots right now, doing lots of experiments. I don't think we'll talk about that here. Maybe later tonight, we have another event. But through this, there are 3 sort of principles, and each one of them have a through line to something worth thinking about as we create, as all of you create new startups. First principle, well, there are 3 things. I'll tell you all 3 of those. First one is that we have no staff, no paid staff. Second principle is that we don't do any fundraising. We never ask. And the third principle is we have no impact aspirations. So you look at that and you say, why does this guy have the mic? Right? Like, what exactly are you doing? If you don't have staff, you have no money, and you have no impact, like, then what's the point? Turns out that this looks like a lemonade stand, right? Like a child would understand. They have no lemonade stand, no staff, right? No money. And who knows what impact? They're not looking at impact. Maybe it touches you, maybe it doesn't. So you look at that and you say, this is childish. But if you stick with it long enough, it's actually way more adult than all the schemes we have created as humanity. So what have we learned, right, through each one of those? The first thing is that when you don't have paid staff, when you're not engaging in transaction, you move from extrinsic motivators to intrinsic motivators. You really start to understand. So if you look at the current world, right, look at the Gallup polls, they say, I mean, anywhere, there's a bunch of different polls, but employee engagement in the corporations is like 15 to 30%, 30 max. Like 70 to 80% of the people in companies are disengaged. But we just think that's the best you can do. Why are they disengaged? Carrot and stick model is not working. It doesn't even work in education. We have a lot of neuroscience now that backs this up. So if you look at this, you're like, wow, I don't think we understand people at all. Because 4 out of 5 of your staff that you're hiring, that you're paying, are mostly disengaged. They're just doing their small little bit just to use you to get the money. Why? How can I increase? Everyone wants to solve this, but no one knows how to do it. So because we were, so if you look at motivations, it's an interesting thing to think about, especially as you create. Right? Deven used the word labor of love. So on one side, you have the private sector, which is really focused on extrinsic motivators. On the other side, you have the voluntary sector, the lemonade stands, which is focused on the intrinsic motivators. And then you have the public sector, which is supposed to balance both of these in a healthy society. But what's, of course, happened is that you have the private sector overtaking the public sector, and then the voluntary is almost like, it's like, I've been a volunteer for so long, and when you go to parties and you tell people, it's like, hey, what do you do? And I say, I volunteer. And they're like, what do you really do? And I say, I really volunteer. And it's almost like that doesn't count. If I said I was like a billionaire, to be like, oh, okay, that's cool, yeah. Right? But volunteer is like, oh, yeah. But why is that? Right? Why have we stuffed everything into the private sector in this way? But underneath it, you have to say, why are we so moved by extrinsic motivators and not intrinsic? When it's not even effective, it's just you have 20% engagement rate in corporations. Like, how do we start to really bring in the intrinsic motivators? So that's a question. That's something we learned because we are all intrinsic motivators. 25 years. like thousands and thousands and thousands of volunteers. We've never once had volunteer of the year. We were like, why do you need that? And so we can talk more about it, but its fundamental principle, I call this generative heart intelligence. Generative AI is the big buzzword. This is my generative high. And the way heart intelligence works is that you serve without transaction. When you do, there is an inner transformation that happens in you, not because you or I want it. It makes no difference whether you believe something or not. You can be totally a skeptic. You go out and give. They did this study at Harvard. They said they gave them money. They said you can spend it on yourself at a mall, or you can go give it to a stranger. So even the skeptics who are like, oh, forget it, I'm never going to give to a stranger, when they do, guess what happens? Nature rewards you. Dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, endorphins. It's like eating 2,000 chocolate bars. And so the way we think about it is that you're nature funded. You're not market funded. You're literally nature funded. This is why we don't need to have a, volunteer of the year. Because nature is giving you the reward right then and there. And this is like neuroscience, so I just don't know why people aren't tapping into this incredible gold mine. We're all after transactional ways of doing things. And when you do this, it's not just that you are empowered, it's that when you move from me to we and I move from me to we, it actually creates that murmuration, the birds that you saw. It creates a whole greater than the sum of the parts. And then we love to joke that the reward for service is more service. If you do it right, it doesn't need anything. So so we were in this ecosystem of purely intrinsic motivators because we didn't have staff. We just have volunteers just wanting to serve and serve and serve and serve. It's totally autocatalytic. So that's one thing, right? To move from, if you like to think of it as reciprocity, to go from direct reciprocity, which is transaction, to indirect, that we are all bald people. Do we have any bald people here? Oh my God, am I the one? Oh, there it is, Marco, thank you. So we will say, we're all a group of bald people and we will help each other, right? You get honorary membership to the Bald Club. But as soon as you create that, what ends up happening is you have the non-bald people outside, right? The in circle and the out circle. And so how do you do infinite reciprocity? And if you actually study the greatest change makers on the planet, you'll see, like Gandhi, they're playing an infinite game. They're not saying, I'm going to only be nonviolent if I can get independence for India. He was not interested. That was a secondary thing. He's interested in principle first. So that was the first thing. The second thing is that when you don't fundraise, you really tune into alternate forms of wealth. Everybody's just after money, everywhere. And it's so silly because we play so many games around money. And it's a zero-sum game because it's a degenerative resource. Fundamentally, if you look at the design of money, it's issued as debt, which means interest. And to repay that interest, I need growth. And when you need perpetual growth for finite resources, you're going to create extractive systems. It's baked into the logic. And you say, well, without money, what can I do? I gave a talk once called, Can You Create Social Change Without Money? It's an amazing, you'd be amazed that we don't take this seriously, but how do you think about, in the designs you create, how do you think about alternate forms of wealth? Firoz was a guy, he had 5,000 people reporting to him at SAP, and then he had a son. His son was autistic. Totally changed his life. But he learned a lot about autism, and he says, oh my God, you know what? Everybody's good at something, even people on the autism spectrum. They're never late, they never get bored, they never lie. So he says, how can I restructure my problems to include their gifts? And he hired 5 people on the autism spectrum. again, became a Harvard case study. This is his son, Vivan, now much older. And the CEO of SAP comes to him and says, Firoz, by 2020, this is back then, I want 1% of all my staff to be on the autism spectrum. Multiple forms of wealth. Is it that Einstein quote, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it's not really going to work out. And that's what we do. When I interview you, that's what I would do. I need this. Can you fit that? But can we actually work in a different way? What are these multiple forms of capital, right? What are these multiple forms of wealth? I mean, there's thousands and thousands of them, right? Compassion, attention, knowledge, culture, technology. You can go down the list and they're all designed differently. We do so much to circulate the belief of money. But what would time capital look like? What would smile capital look like? So the thing is if I have pencils and I give you pencils, if I have 5 pencils, I give you 4, I have 4 less. So it's a degenerative resource. But if I have a smile, I give you a smile, I feel like smiling more. If I give you a hug, I feel like hugging more. If I am generous, I feel like being more generous. It's a regenerative resource. So you have different forms of wealth and they all have different properties. So a really out-of-the-box sort of designer would look at this whole array. Instead of just painting with 2 or 3 colors, why not paint with 1,000 colors? It's not to say money is bad, but it's to say, wow, how can I integrate this, right? Again, same with the first one. It's not like extrinsic motivators are bad, but how do you integrate extrinsic with intrinsic? We did this at a conference, so where you had, and now in fact at one of these TEDx events, we're going to do this. It's going to be the first TEDx that does this, and my hope is that it spreads to all TED events. I'm sure we'll create a big hoopla about it, but at this conference we said, you pay with financial capital, you buy a ticket. But with that, we said you can also do 5 acts of kindness, and kindness wealth counts. You can do 8 hours of meditation and write a reflection, and silence wealth counts. You can go out and do a 5-minute selfie on the theme of the conference, and that creativity wealth counts. Community wealth. You can go out and volunteer at an NGO in the community, and we'll factor that in as well. So we called them untickets. So out of 800 people, 300 were untickets. As soon as you do that, you change the possibility of what's there in the field. You're not now just giving, everybody likes to do all this sliding scale, but the organizers are thinking, well, I have free seats anyway, so let me fill it up. And the person receiving is just saying, well, okay, I just got a freebie. Right? But if you can actually deepen that whole process in a meaningful way, like what happens? In our case, this woman, the first woman that actually gave this creativity wealth, she shared an incredible story. It was so incredible that we actually put her on the stage, and she was part of the programming. So multiple forms of wealth can really go pretty far. Right? So if the first one is taught us about intrinsic motivations, second one taught us about alternate forms of wealth, and what the third one did was taught us about many-to-many. Small acts. As soon as you don't have impact, you care for the process. And when you care for the process, instead of a broadcast network, you create a deepcast network. What that means is you go from one-to-many networks, one of me, many of you, the TV model, to one-to-one networks where we all know each other. Business people sometimes have this kind of, I shouldn't say that, that's not nice. But sometimes we were like, oh my God, like so many amazing people in the room, if we all just connected with each other. Like, okay, if you do, you'll have 1,225 connections. But if you actually build trust and you have a many-to-many network with just 50 people, you have 100 million trillion connections. With just 50 people. Then if you make it interspecies, it's a whole different league altogether. So how many of us can see, okay, 100 million trillion would be too high, right? Like, can we at least see 1 or 2 trillion? Who do we have to be? Who must we become through what we do that we can stop being so cheap in the 50 to 1200 range is usually what most of us see in a room, right? And you can see that when you're not transactional, you don't centralize, you really start to create distributed systems. Um, so Frederick Laloux has done all this work on how we organize. He says we used to organize as wolf packs, very reactionary. You threaten me, I pull out my gun, you pull out your gun, and one of us dies. Right? Then we got a little smarter and we organized in top-down ways, which is military, which is typical religious organizations as well, churches, everything. Then he says we got a little smarter in modern day corporations were interchangeable parts, which means that you either do this job or if you're that Dr. V, if you're that security guard, traditional CEO would just fire you, right? Like, because I don't need you. What do I need you for? Or you have layoffs, all these things. But, but when you fire somebody, when you let them go, you're actually letting go of the entire relational web around them. So we got a little smarter than that. And then we had purpose-driven organizations. And now I think what we're thinking about is living systems approach, where everyone is connected to everything, right? That 100 million trillion kind of a sense. And that is a very different way of operating. And I would say that this is the narrow and the broad margin goals that we need to negotiate. It's not one or the other, but we have to figure out in our startups how market logic can reside with this broad margin goal of love logic. And it's a tension. It's not like one or the other. It's not like I have got the right thing and you need to do that and that's the recipe and that's going to save the planet. If that was the case, we would have figured it out by now. That's not the case. We need a polyculture field. Transaction, and I think where we diverge ways is from transaction to relationship. If you go to transaction, we kind of get to extraction and we get to disconnection. But relationships start to build context, which then leads to deeper community, which then leads to a field of consciousness and ultimately gets us at compassion. Right? It awakens in that. But the bridge, the fork in the road is, are you transactional or are you relational? And I think when we start to lead with the gifts of relationships, we start to move to not just leadership, but laddership. And again, this is a thing that we can all explore. If you're a traditional leader and I'm like, yeah, great, the most powerful person in the world, that's traditional leadership. Laddership is saying, I want to lead with the gifts of emergence. And I'll say more about that. I mean, I guess I don't have to. I mean, maybe we can pause if you want. Should I just go through this? What do you think? Just go, you guys, we're all here. It's a little hot, but we're all here. Yeah? Just go through a couple more things and then we can engage. I think this is an interesting spiritual question, but also an AI question. Right? If you move from transaction to relationship, and if the density of relationships in a room starts to increase, what you get to is flow, right? High density of relationships. It's very interesting because if you look at your neurons, I mean, there's competing theories, but most people will say the neurons are actually not conscious. But then when neurons start engaging with each other and there's a high density of relationships in our brain, the brain becomes conscious. Like scientists say the brain is conscious, but neurons have a very low coefficient of consciousness. So at what point do things start to become conscious? And so what point is there this flow? And how do we lead with that flow? And I think the first step is to sense into that 100 million trillion, right? In any group, any circle. I think the second step is to embrace the flow. It's a very different leadership quality. Typically, no surfer says, oh, this is a bad wave, can I change the wave? You have to learn to adjust to the wave. But that's a very different quality, right? How do you learn to embrace the wave? How do you learn to embrace the flow? And then from there, how do you learn to actually just deeply trust in the flow? And what trusting in the flow gets you to is this notion that 1 + 1 is greater than 2, because the plus sign has value. So if we're in these zero-sum games, your resources and mine, let's do something together, what you end up with is you go from relationship to synergy, your and my things together. But emergence is where you bring these things together that have new properties. So hydrogen and oxygen don't have liquid properties, but if they come together in a certain way, you have liquid properties. So who do we have to be to come together in a certain way to create new properties? That's emergence. And how do we lead with the gifts of emergence? So it's not just going from transaction to relationship. It's saying, well, as those relationships start to multiply, you get to this flow. And as you get to this flow, you have this incredible emergence that arises. And so, I mean, we can talk about this if you have questions, but I think the one thing I will point out on this slide is this difference between leadership and laddership. And it's not one or the other. We have to balance both. Right? So leadership is plan and execute, and that's just a dated model. So if you give me your 5-year plan, like I was saying, I mean, that's a joke. That just means you're not tuned in to the world. What you need, on the other hand, is search and amplify, which means the premium goes from doing, like I am a charismatic leader, I can get you guys to go in that one direction. That's traditional leadership. But laddership is looking for patterns of positive deviance and amplifying them. So it's search and amplify. So I would often go to our interns and I would be like, well, what are you seeing here? We can, we won't do that here, but we could go around the circle and you say, what are you seeing here? And it's very clear that most of us don't have any practice in this. And so we are seeing very little because we're so rooted in our me part of ourselves. So, you can go, where does innovation happen? Not at the center, but the edges. You go from an efficiency framework to a resiliency framework. You go from, what do we got next? Predictability, from emergency to emergence. And you go from quantity of ties to the quality. Quality of the ties really matters if what you're trying to do is awaken. So these are leadership qualities, but I think this is a CEO of an insurance company. He's passed away now, Bill Hanover. He said something profound. He says, the success of an intervention, we all want to change things, right? So we're always intervening. So success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. But this is not true in leadership. Because if I'm a board member and you're a CEO, if you're a bad guy or a good guy, I don't really care. You get me what I need you to get me, and if you don't, I'll replace you. So in leadership, it doesn't matter, but in laddership, it makes tremendous difference because who you are determines who you see, and who you see will determine how you can search and amplify. So the interior condition of the intervener is, because the interior condition is what tells you, are you seeing 50 people in the room or are you seeing 100 million trillion? And if you can see 100 million trillion, then you're a much more successful ladder, but that is dependent on your interior condition. So this, you can see, is much harder because you have to actually be the change, so to speak. Right? And so this last concept of Dr. Martin Luther King, he says, peace is not the absence of tension. It's actually the skillful embrace, like a violin string, too tight, pops. Too loose, no music. You need the perfect tension. And so laddership is fundamentally the skillful embrace of tension. And you say tension between what? I hate you, you hate me, let's get along? No. That's a very superficial tension. You have to break that down into its core building blocks. So this, you can see the tension between content and context. How much of what I say is my content? Could I just have my AI in 2 years be here? Or is there more to my context that's affecting how you receive my words? We have to constantly be thinking about this. Motivation, we talked about intrinsic and extrinsic. How do we juggle between both of those? And sometimes they're polar opposites. Wealth, multiple forms of capital and financial forms of capital. Pricing. Do we go with trust or are we transactional? It's not one or the other. That would be easy. It's like you have to live into the dynamic tension of it. And you have to create an ecosystem that can adjust and live into that. Speed. Should we go at the speed of emergence, which is kind of this ripple effect, whatever happens, or should we actually be focused on solving the immediate problems of the world? Emergence sounds nice, sounds less violent, but if there was a fire and you were like, look, I'll just wait for the emergence of the rain, I know I have extra water, but let's just trust in divine forces. Like, that's not very wise, right? It doesn't work. Gandhi and Ambedkar had this famous debate, and Gandhi was biased towards, they both did emergency and emergence, but Gandhi was biased towards emergence. And Ambedkar said, oh, that's the tyranny of incrementalism. So where do we stand on that? Where is our spot, right? Scale. You use the word scalable in the thing, you say, okay, well, we should scale because I want to affect 1 billion people tomorrow. Actually, it would be great, 8 billion. Let me just change the world in my view. But should we actually have a unique expression of each of our deeper natures? Or should we go with something monoculture? Same solution for everybody. Both have their advantages. Because if you do the sameness, then you have economies of scale. But then you lose something. And if you just do all unique, man, you may never get anywhere. I was in Bhutan and they were like, gross national happiness and all. They said, yeah, but we want good roads. And that you're going to get through a monoculture approach. So monoculture, polyculture, unique, universal. Not so simple. Outreach, right? Deepcast or broadcast? Because we all say, oh my God, I have the best idea on the planet. I just need people. So if you can please give me a big mic, that will solve all my problems. A bigger hammer, right? We want all our stuff to be like, and everyone, all startups are all fighting like for that extra bit. But how do we balance broadcast with deepcast? What is deepcast? Heart to heart to heart. The biggest change makers, like you can say Vinoba was one of the greatest change makers post-Gandhi. Unimaginable things he did. You met Vinoba. He was just telling me earlier, Gijubai? Gijubai said, there are only 2 people I've met with such deep eyes, the mother and Vinoba. I went, he says, I donated 1/6 of my salary to him. And as a result, I got a few moments with him and I looked in his eyes and it was like, deep eyes. If you would have met a CEO or something like that, he met me too, he met you. He didn't say, it didn't leave that deep impression, He's like, you guys. But what was it about that deep cast? And can you and I be that? Like, how do we balance this? Again, not to say broadcast is bad, but how do we balance all this, right? So, and leadership and laddership. It's not that you don't need leadership. You have to be strong, certainly, many times. But how do we balance that with leadership? And I think fundamentally, we speak about this in the AI context, is that, we have big data, but how do we balance that with deep data? We have these pendants that are now $60. That's going to record everything you hear and see. I mean, the value of all our content is really quickly going to zero, including our IQs. Right? So the fact that you can process and you have opinions and you have ideas, all that is like AI is going to be able to do that way better. Already it's destroying that. But what is it about you and me that is more than our content? What is that deep data? And how do we create with that? Again, not just deep data, but deep and big. How do we actually hold both of those together? I think that's what makes startup service unique. Right? If you just say, I want to profit out of big data and create a big company and become a billionaire, everyone in the Silicon Valley right now, this is the gold rush. So if you want billions, if you want power, if you want fame, you really should be doing AI stuff. I know lots of people doing that at the highest echelons of society in all those sectors. But I think what makes us all different is that we're asking, how do we, not to discard that, not to have an allergic reaction to it, but to say, how do we use the gifts of that, but marry that with far deeper resources? Far deeper resources that are unlocked when I am being the change that I wish to see in the world, when I am focusing on my inner transformation, when I am not just defined by what I do, but who I'm becoming in that very process. And so I think today is an experiment in all of this. And yesterday I spoke, last night, we were talking about Hang Mai. We had a retreat with permaculture farmers in Vietnam. And I met this one woman who sort of translated that book and has become an icon for permaculture farmers in Vietnam. Incredible change maker. And I was at her farm and I asked her a question. So I'll leave you with that 1 minute video or maybe 30-second video. So hopefully we can hear it. Marco, you do your magic. Mai in Vietnam, and I asked her the question, well, what's the most commonly asked inquiry that you get when you go to the cities? And what would you say, Hang Mai?
The questions we often ask is what to grow here instead of what grows here.
Wow. So simple. So deep. Instead of saying what to grow here, which is your typical entrepreneurial mindset, that I have all these resources, what to grow here. But what she's saying is underneath your thought and intellect and your sense of identity is a web of relations. And in that web of relations, stuff is growing already. So instead of saying what to grow here, can we tune in and say what grows here? Instead of your company or your project maturing at some point and saying, well, what is my vision? Instead of that, you turn the lens and say, what is growing here? Because for 5 years, we have been doing this. In service space, this is all we do. Like if you ask me, what is service space going to, I had no idea last year we were going to do anything with AI. And now we have all these major companies, household names, their heads are like coming to us and saying, oh, how are you guys? What's going on? This is a very different kind of intelligence. But we didn't come up with it. We just listened to the field. It's like, what grows here? And this started growing. And so we supported it. Who knows what grows there tomorrow? So it's not just in a certain moment, but how do we then keep that fitness function? How do we keep that principle at the core of our design process? So we're constantly tuning in to what grows here, what is growing here, right? What's actually emerging. And underneath it, nothing's going to emerge unless you have relationships. If you don't have relationships, then you better have a think tank. But if you look at like greatest examples of things that have changed human history, this is not Steve Jobs and the iPhone, although Steve was pretty spiritual too. This is Gandhi going on the Dandi March. And right before he goes, he asks Tagore. Tagore asks him, Bapu, whole country is looking at you. Even the British are looking at you. What's your next move? He had access to everything. He could have said, oh, you're so smart, you're so smart, you're so rich, you're so powerful, let's get you together and let's scheme, You know what he said? 2 days before the Dandi March, that you can say redefined history. He says to Tagore, I don't know, but you can be sure that I'm praying. Which raw materials is he creating his startup with? Because he's leading a giant startup, 300 million people at the time, everyone looking to him. And he's saying, I need to respond, and he's not scheming with the intellect. So he would fit right in an AI world. He would not be threatened by AI at all, because he's like, oh, that's just the end of intellect, end of content. But I'm much more than that. Right? So these questions, as we create, right, these are uncommon questions. So I don't know, if they're not interesting to you, please throw it away. Right? But at least for me, they're very interesting, and it just gives you an infinite playground to play in. Because these resources, no one is going after them. Everyone is going after these very small transactional resources, and these giant pots of gold are like right there for the creation. And there's so much suffering in the world, so much disconnection. We need to innovate. We need to create new solutions, but with a different toolkit. And we can do that. And I think we have to struggle with these balances. I don't think there's one right answer. But if we hold these different questions, maybe we get to different solutions. So that's what I'm experimenting with, and I hope perhaps some of that is useful for you. So with that, I will say thank you for your kind attention. And more than that, thank you for, this is just my experience, doesn't make it right or wrong. But I would say what does make it beautiful is thank you for holding harder questions. To juggle these things is much harder than to say, how will I just get ahead? How will I become, I don't know, a billionaire? And I know plenty of them. So for me, like a lemonade stand is actually more impressive. You may not believe it, but I mean, this is maybe I'm just a kid at heart, right? But that is more impressive than being a head of state or being a gazillionaire, because that connects you to the infinite. What Vinoba would say, he would say that the sole purpose of my work is not land gift movement. That's just for the Time magazine cover. The sole purpose of my work is to connect heart to heart. He had a pretty big startup. He did an innovation nobody else has done, 5 million acres of land. Like, we have far less, and we go to decades of war for those lesser pieces of land. 5 million acres. You gave 1/6 of your salary that month voluntarily. And he's saying, I'm not after that salary. I'm not after that land. I'm not after the Time magazine cover. I'm just trying to connect heart to heart. But in the process of leading with inner transformation, people come together, projects emerge, and it creates phenomenal impact. So I hope we keep experimenting in that direction, maybe. So thank you for your kind attention. And thank you for turning on that fan, Marco. I appreciate that. So I hand it over to Devin, or do you want to do a couple of reflections, or do we have time? Or short? Okay. So maybe yes. I will be the mic guy.
I thought I could speak without the mic. It's better you hold the mic. I can speak.
Oh,
better.
okay.
Then
You can be
answer.
loud. Okay, okay.
So, in the way you introduced the study space, you said it's a radical organization, which is kind of no staff, no
Fundraising,
impact,
no
no
impact.
fundraising, all those things. But towards the end, you also said, like quoting Martin Luther King, that tension is
Yeah,
important.
yeah,
The tension is between all sorts of things that he showed.
yeah.
Why is that study space is not taking the tension and resorting to one side of that pendulum or that balance?
Oh, we are absolutely. We have constant tension.
No, but the tension is not around like you are completely saying no money
But that introduces other set of tensions.
okay.
So anyone who has lived, who doesn't charge for their labor, that is not tension-free life.
Yes, I understand, but that's I'm just trying to understand in the context of the kind of startups we want to envision.
Yeah.
Or we're getting more of service space or more of urban life care, or like what if that it becomes a bit unclear because
Yeah.
while you
see.
yourself as a speaker or saying that
Yeah.
this is what
I'm telling my story, but
this is what we do, and then at the end it says about Martin, like
Yeah.
balance between these two.
So I think the invitation is that, so I think what I shared was my story and my experience, but I think the invitation is not to copy paste my story, is to actually find your story. And only you know the answer to that. So how will you, I don't think any two people can look at all, we do this laddership pod with 30 days of these different spectrums, 30 different spectrums. And when you look at that, you say there are no two people, no two creators, no two innovators, change makers that lie on the exact same spot of each spectrum. So the invitation, I told you the service-based story and you know where we stand. And that introduces a whole bunch of different tensions. But the point is not to, copy that. Now that gives you some insight into intrinsic motivators. It gives you insights into many-to-many networks, alternate forms of capital. And to that purpose, the story has some meaning. But really, I think the practice is for you to become conscious of these things. So if you do a startup and a funder comes to you, a venture capitalist comes to you, I can just tell you my story, right? Like, so someone comes and says, Nipun, I want you to get on Oprah, because he was like president of HBO and all this stuff, right? And because we were doing these small acts of kindness and smile cards and stuff. And we said, well, where do we stand on this tension? Broadcast and deepcast. We said no. And people were like, well, don't you care to spread kindness in the world? But it comes with its own consequences, so you kind of have to find your spot. In 2007, Skoll Foundation came to us and said, you guys are changing the world in beautiful ways. Here's $1 million. Money and alternate forms of capital. Pros and cons. Where do we find our center of gravity? We said no. And they were shocked. They said, no one has ever said no to our, Skoll was the founder, first president of eBay. No one has said no. So they had a board meeting and they invited me and it says, we want to learn why you would say no. And we talked about it, but the punchline, if I had to say it in one sentence, I said, well, you're giving this because you want to scale this. And we're independent of scale. That maybe it scales, but at the end of next year, you might say, how has this scaled and in what way, in what form? To us, that's not an interesting question. And we don't want to bring that kind of question into our ecology. But that's where we stood, right? But if I'm doing a different kind of a startup, we would have a very different kind of project. And if you have a different kind of project, you might use this, you might use much more of this, and you might use much less of this. right? You might have to go fast up front, then you have to go slow later, or you know, and it's not like a static thing. It's like I'm at point, you know, on a spectrum of 0 to 1, I'm at 0.4 on this spectrum, and you don't just stay at 0.4. You have a living system where it's constantly evolving. So that's a much harder thing. So this is where this actually just raises questions. Like, I don't really have any answers. Because I don't even know if I have a static answer for my own organization. Like, it just has to be a living relationship. For you to be an effective agent of an ecosystem that is alive, you have to be tuned in. So the premium is less on what is your coefficient on each spectrum. It's more on what are your practices to be tuned in? And that who you're becoming. Like, that's the point. It's not like copy the Arvind model. It has merit. Maybe you do. Fine. But copy Dr. V being humble outside instead of firing his security guard and humbly waiting for 2-3 hours. Copy Ishwar Kaka, not for his schemes of, and he operated in a traditional way. He would fundraise, right? These examples are very different than service-based. But what is common is they were rooted in who you were becoming. That, yeah, when I grow older, like, I hope my wife can say, I don't know. I think I don't know. I'll have to check with her, you know. That's a tricky one, right? But like, that's the point. Not whether, so we were all at different equations on all these different spectrums, and in this room we would all be at different ones, but underneath it, it's like who we are becoming is very critical. Who we are even is very critical, and how to factor that into what we do. And if you don't have that capacity, if you just see 50 people in this room, you have to invest in growing that capacity. That would be my invitation. So it's like one layer below the model is actually at the level of values.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying.
Does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Oh, yeah, especially given my long answer. Sorry. Yeah.
It's okay, because people behind may not be.
So what I really have is not a question, but maybe a conflict I'm sitting with, or what you just called like a struggle with balance. Because I worked for a decade in advertising, and then I moved to the social sector. So kind of I understand the leadership and laddership model. Um, And now, when I work with individuals or organization, um, there is a certain privilege I feel when you can think about these things. Like the very fact I have the access to what you're saying is, or anybody of us, is because we have certain privilege, right? Um, and at times, and every fiber of my body resonates with what you're saying right now. But when an organization or an entrepreneur or an individual is going through the struggle of survival, how does one convinces them or even reaches to a point where they can really make them understand the value of leadership when survival is kind of more important? And the other question is, and I understand the healthy balance, uh, but do you think there is a way where an individual or an organization can practice leadership for a controlled time and then eventually have a segue into leadership, which would make more sense? Because my struggle with working with either organizations or individuals or leaders has been, I'm able to kind of convey my own biasness and thoughts, but I can't change the reality of what they are going through. And at times, at an emotional level or even at um, a level of survival, they might not even resonate with all of the things that I'm saying, because I might just give them a framework around leadership and just go away and meet them maybe after 2-3 months, but they are the ones who are kind of sitting with that burnout and survival. I know people who have mortgaged their houses to pay salaries. Now, how do I how do I talk about, or how do I really make them understand laddership when they would need a very strict structure, something very cut to cut, very high focus on sales? It's not really a question. It's just like I wanted to say it out loud, and maybe you can talk about it.
I, I think I think that's a very real issue, right? So at one level, I think we have to struggle with it. But I think this notion of privilege and survival is a confused idea, because that's sort of market logic overtaking our inner love logic. So a lot of people, when we were in our walking pilgrimage, a lot of people would say that first you need to have stuff before you give. That giving is a luxury sport. What that does is underneath it, you are saying that I was born bankrupt. Right? That first I have to acquire and be like you, not you, but I'm saying, be this way, and only then. Like Maslow's hierarchy of needs says you need this, then this, then this, and then self-actualization. Maslow himself said, wrong, I actually take it back. But we've forgotten about that. And we said, this is very convenient, because then I can get people who are in the slums and say, please, you should get a job, and then you should suffer like me, and then maybe we'll talk about awakening, right? That, oh, I have survival and burnout issues, but then have you questioned the social operating system in your organization? And you're like, well, I don't have the privilege of questioning that. It's kind of a pretty chicken and egg problem. Right? You're like, the reason why you have this is the reason why you should be asking that question. But you're like, I can't afford it. It's like somebody, when we were on our walking pilgrimage, we had absolutely nothing. And if we spent the day saying, I can't afford to be kind and generous, so please take care of me. You should take care of me. I'm a fellow citizen. Right? You would die. No one cares for you. You're just not that significant. So you will actually have to go into that state, and that's when generosity is most important. That's actually when laddership is most critical, because your current approach of transaction has led you to this place. So you are saying, I need more resources, I'm in that mode, so I can be more transactional and hopefully get out of this transaction. That, I would say, is a losing logic. What you really need to do is innovate far more radically. Right? So we had an NGO retreat in Bombay a few days ago, where founders of 50 NGOs came together, some of them doing phenomenal impact. In fact, even after that, there's this woman named Sister Lucy. She's done amazing work across India. And her logic is that, if God shows me a need, a child or a woman, especially started with women, on the streets, she picks them up and brings them home. Like tens of thousands of them. Most of us look and we try to avoid contact. She adopts them for life until they're better off. And if they can go out on their own, they do that, right? And so when she was at our place in the Silicon Valley, somebody once asked her, she says, Sister Lucy, that's not a very scalable idea. And she says, how can you bring everyone home, right? And her logic is, hey, if God shows me a need, I have to respond to that need, and it's God's job to find the resources. But she's able to scale a massive organization with that attitude. And when she was with us just a few days ago, she says that for the last 2 or 3 months, I had gotten caught. Their tagline says, always room for one more. And she said they had no funding. I mean, as in no surplus funding. So she sent out a note after probably 30, 40 years of existence, right? And lakhs and lakhs of people that they have served. She says, I sent out a note to all my staff across 68 centers they have across India. And she says, I know our tagline says always room for one more, but we don't have any money. We cannot accept anyone. And that day, this woman came with 6 kids. Extremely poor, very tragic situations, right? I won't go into those stories. And she says, I had to ask myself, why is there not room for one more? And she said she meditated, she prayed, and she realized that she had lost the connection. She was in her mind instead of her heart. And she says, I have gotten from 0 to here with the capacity of my heart. How can I let my mind overtake? And she said, and she shared a whole story of how she went from that survival logic to the love logic. So it's at those times when that logic says, oh my God, like you cannot afford to love, but we need to question that narrative and say, you cannot afford not to love. You cannot, sorry, you don't like the word love, so I'll say it. You cannot afford not to be thinking of laddership, for instance, or whichever spectrum. Right? You cannot afford to not think of context. You cannot afford to not think of deep cast. You cannot afford not to bring your leadership team and say, what are the multiple forms of capital that are growing in our ecosystem? How do we engage with those and how do we build on that? Right? Like, so I would flip that and maybe challenge that, provoke that, and yeah, it's a journey though. Like I don't think there's a right answer because how much do you then provoke, right? How long do you wait? How much do you invest? Do you even risk your own existence and survival? Sister Lucy's willing to do that. She's willing to say that this is more important, but probably a small, an average corporation wouldn't do that because they would be like, oh my God, so many people depend on my salary. Salary, forget salary. These people have absolutely no sign of hope. If Sister Lucy doesn't feed them, take care of them. Some of them are even mentally so unstable they cannot even have a conversation with you. They are counting on Sister Lucy, and Sister Lucy is saying, oh, hey, I have to not use that logic. So there are these examples. Ishwar Kaka, Dr. V, like all these guys are examples in that sense. So we have to ask ourselves some of these harder questions, at least experiment with it, like even if it feels like, oh, this is too much, this is way out there, which it can seem like, but go in there, plant us. And if you as a person, like go in there and plant a small seed, it doesn't need to be that, oh, all of a sudden we are transformed from this organization to this. It's that you plant seeds and see what grows and keep planting seeds. That's what permaculture farmers do. They don't weed, they don't till the soil, they just throw seed balls. And it can go pretty far. Not because you or I are amazing as seed planters, but because nature carries it. And nature is strong. By nature, I don't mean physical nature, but the 2,000 chocolate bars. So yeah, and today I think I'll just end with this, that I think we are all going to think about this, and I think this is the design challenge for us, is to actually incorporate a much larger canvas of what impact means, of what scale means, of what speed means, of what power means, of what money means. Like these are all real issues that you have to find a thing on, and what is the right spot for you? Individually, collectively, in your startup group, in your company if you're already running one, in your movement if you're running an entire movement. And so it's less answers, but more questions, important questions.